left off last time talking about post, or rather neoclassical poetics, and bleeding into Romantic poetics. And I said that I would continue that today, more on the Romantic poetic side of things rather than the neoclassical. But it's interesting because, and this is one of the problems of defining Romanticism, is it defines itself against so many things. It defines itself against reason, imagination, the poets of the imagination, as opposed to poets of reason, the age of reason, which is the age of Pope and Swift and so forth. You could see Romanticism versus the Enlightenment. You could see Romanticism versus neoclassicism. You could see Romanticism as in the imagination versus reason. You can see all sorts of things, or you can see it as I see it, that that Romanticism is actually an extension of the Enlightenment. It's just that it reverses its verdict on the goodness of the things that are in the past. It romanticizes the medieval. It romanticizes the realm of early origins. It romanticizes the child. It romanticizes a pre-civilized state of affairs. It makes us long for things in their origins. Its hero, as I've said, and will repeatedly say, is not just the child, but the orphan child. And that portrait of human nature in its ideal form, the heroism of the orphan child, persists to this very day. So in that sense, even though, when you get people discussing culture and they want to talk about eras of literature, which we all do, and English curricula throughout the Western world, they'll have the medieval period and the Renaissance period and the Elizabethan period, the Jacobeans. It depends how narrowly you want to define all these things. And then the 17th century, and then the 18th, neoclassical age, and then the Romantics, and then the Victorians, and then the moderns, and then the 20th century. They've all got that laid out. But C.S. Lewis argues in his maiden lecture at Cambridge University, in a work that I have mentioned before, but I don't know if I had you read, although I think I had some of you read it. I'll just write it on the board here. It's called De Descriptione Temporum. That was the title of the lecture, which was then published because it was as I say, the maiden lecture he gave as the newly installed chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, a chair that was created for Mr. Lewis himself, because he was representing, they were effectively acknowledging his expertise in both literatures, which were seen in the academy, even then in its early beginnings, as two not only discrete areas, but contradictory areas. The medieval period is, yes, it's Christian, but it's irrational. It's the sort of the Edmund Burke take on Christianity. Or you can see various atheistic takes on the Middle Ages. It's an age of superstition, of magical belief in magic, a belief that the earth is flat. I mean, all sorts of weird allegations about the medieval period, which any study of the medieval period will show to be not only fallacious, but lacking in any awareness or knowledge of the period, because the Enlightenment, although it calls itself the age of reason, is nowhere near as rational as the medieval period, where everything's rationally ordered. I mean, read Dante, read Aquinas. This is a very rationally understood cosmos. And the Enlightenment, for all of its claims of rationality, we will see the rise of all sorts of things like animism and belief outright in magic, which Lewis observes actually in his own work, he doesn't even see any signs of this in the medieval period. It emerges first in the early 16th century. That's when magic starts to be consideration. Not there in the medieval period at all. So if you wanted to identify it with a period, you would actually say what we see come the Enlightenment is a rise in rationalism and irrationalism, and they are seen as opposites, but really they're rooted in what I believe is a divorce of reason and feeling, and a divorce of reason and nature, and a divorce of the imagination from reason, which a divorce that is still not settled. The children of this divorce are us, and we are self-interpreting orphans of this bogus worldview. I said to you last class that in Descartes' Cogito, famous lines, cogito, ergo sum, which comes at the conclusion as the sort of finale for his method of doubt. Remember, it's his discourse on method, and the method is the method of doubt. And what he is seeking to do in his discourse on method is to obtain certainty, because there are so many ideas out there that seem radically skeptical, that Mr. Descartes, in order to fend off his own doubts, says, I need a sure basis for certainty than just appealing to the Aristotelian cosmology, for instance, because Mr. Galileo has exploded that view of cosmology. It can't be the fact that we are at the center, the Earth is at the center of a ordered cosmos, because Galileo has just demonstrated there are novas, there are new things in this old cosmology. There aren't supposed to be novas. And he shows with his telescope that there are 4 moons that are going around Jupiter. They're not revolving around the Earth. There's things that totally contradict that cosmology. And so with that doubt in his mind, he said, I have to establish a better form of certainty. And the way I'm going to do that is by doubting everything I can't be certain about. So it's a radical method of doubt. And he doubts everything down to the point. So this is the method of the dubito, which I think is more important, although the Western tradition talks about the cogito. It's not really that. It's the method of doubt. He doubts. He knows that he's doubting. That he knows. And if he's doubting, then he's thinking. And if he's thinking, then he concludes he exists. So that's the chain. He begins with doubt. Doubt is a sign that he's thinking. Thinking, he says, is a sign that he exists. Now, when he comes to describe himself, then the self that's doing the doubting is what he calls, I'm repeating myself, but it's not, a res cogitans. That word res, which we saw in Augustine, so important. Note that when Descartes uses the word res, he doesn't mean it in the Augustinian sense of res, as an ultimate reality, or does he? Because for Augustine, remember he talks about res and signa? The res is God. That's the reality, not us, but God. God is the ultimate reality. And things in the order of nature, our language, where there are signs that point us to that reality. Well, Descartes begins with us as that res. And then that res cogitans is the thing that is able to doubt, and that thing that is able to doubt is able to establish his thinking, and therefore he establishes the fact that he exists. And from that, he then will say, and I can conceive of an infinitely greater being than myself, namely God. So God is established on the basis of the res of himself, the ultimate reality of himself. But he is the ultimate reality then, and God then is just a projection of his ultimate reality. It's an imaginative construct. Nobody's persuaded by Descartes, or people are not as persuaded as they ought to be by Descartes' position. I myself am skeptical of it, because it puts man at the center, and his doubting and his thinking at the center of all intellectual life. And I said to you last time, the dubito of the post-Cartesian Enlightenment, rationalism, or empiricism leads to serious problems. And it's antithetical to the Western tradition, which is rooted in the credo, as opposed to the dubito. And Christendom is rooted in the I believe. What do I believe? I don't believe in myself. That's American self-help. No, works. I believe in God the Father, right? So that's the, and based on that belief in an ultimate reality, which is not myself, I can find myself within that tradition. So here's the issue. So this res cogitans gives rise to what we will call, or what has been called, a view of human nature that could be characterized as a ghost in a machine. Because this thinking thing, or this thinking reality, has no connection to the physical world. It's an immaterial. It's what do you want to call it? People call it the mind, and then they'll talk about the problem of Cartesian anthropology is the mind-body problem. They discuss it in philosophy to this day. It's Descartes discovers the mind-body problem. No, he creates the mind-body problem. There is no mind-body problem unless you begin with the method of doubt. Then you have a mind-body problem, because you doubt, in fact, that the thinking thing that you are is even connected to your body. Your body becomes a mechanistic thing at that point. And he calls that body then an extension of the res, a res extensa. It's an extension of that, but it's a physical, so it leads to a very mechanistic view of human nature. And unsurprisingly, then you get views of nature in the 17th and 18th century that are increasingly mechanistic, including God as the creator is what is it? The blind watchmaker. And the universe is like a watch. It's a mechanism. And God is this res cogitans. It's a bigger projection of ourselves that creates this, and everything's an extension of him then. I'm not... See, on this course, I have to do a lot of stuff, a lot of heavy lifting here. And this point is the pivot point, in some ways, from what we had before to what will come after. Everything I've said is clear thus far, right? It's pretty clear. Okay. But that view, which is concurrent with the neoclassical era, has a downstream effect. And I mentioned C.S. Lewis, and I should have not have erased him there. But in De Descriptione Temporum, he says that the shift from towards modernity takes place in the mid-19th century. And he says it comes with what he calls the rise of the machine. Maybe I should see if I can get a quote here. Lewis de Descriptione. Thank you. That'll work. Where is the rise of the machine? I know this essay pretty well. Note this. There's a new archetypal image. It's the image of old machines being superseded by new and better ones. For in the world of machines, the new most often really is better, and the primitive really is the clumsy. And so that idea of the obsolescence of the past and the superiority of the present is so strong in our minds that we worship novelty and innovation like nothing else. And we see the machine as the illustration of this idol of the mind, I'll call it. But he sees it in the mid-19th century, except in his works, he also will say that this idea is picked up by Darwin, among others, and he starts monkeying with human nature and psychology. He starts monkeying with the brain or with the feelings, etc. And it creates a different human nature. It gives a different anthropology, it gives a different theological account of human nature. He says that originates in the 19th century, but it doesn't actually. It originates before that. You can see Darwinism in its nascent form in the Romantic period. And by Romantic period, I'm now saying mid-18th century. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Not about Darwinism, although it gets thrown into there, but an alternative view of human nature than the one that we have seen thus far and characterizes Christendom. And to some degree, the classicism. So I'm just going to leave it rather than erase it in case I want it back. But this little picture here is going to illustrate the Romantic worldview. Let me contrast it with a different picture. This is Las Meninas by Vasquez. This is really interesting. So here's a painting as well. I don't want to spend too long on this, but in terms of perspective, what are we supposed to be looking at in this painting? Pretty obvious, I think. The blonde child in the foreground, right? Of course we are. How do we know that? Light. She's front and center. Light is on her. We are looking at her. That everyone in the painting is looking at her. So she is the center of the portrait. It's typical Renaissance as well, but now this is Las Meninas Vasquez. What is this? This is period. Where's the age? It's early 16th or early 17th century. Anyway, I don't care. Yes, the child is front and center. But we see a little bit more than that in this picture. That's really interesting. Yes, everyone's looking at her for sure. But we find that, what's going on here? Who are these people in the background? This is a mirror. Who is being portrayed in the mirror here? And who's this guy? And who's this guy? This is a painter. There's all sorts of figures in the picture that are focusing on the child, but these are probably her parents who are behind the painter, just like if you're getting a photo taken of your child, the parents stand behind the photographer and they're going, getting the child to smile and behave, because she's got to stand here for hours for this portrait, and she does not want to stand there still. So the parents are there and they're proud in the background, they're looking at, but he puts them in the picture as well, connecting the child to her parents, and to some degree to the painter himself, who's throwing himself there in the side as well. He's also including, the whole world is included in, and it's a relational view of human nature. That's the purpose of putting this up here. Show all this. You even got the dog there. This, on the other hand, is none other than Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer in a Fog, 1820, I believe. And what it shows is the shift from really a Baroque or neoclassical way of looking at things, probably Baroque more than anything, but still with the center focused on a person, towards a person, yes, but a person from the back. A person, in other words, whose face we don't see and whose identity doesn't really matter. Because that person is us. You can fill in, put yourself in his shoes because you're supposed to. He represents all of you. He's every man. But every man doesn't really have an identity. Yeah, he's in the foreground, but actually, as I said to you, we're not looking at him. We're looking at what he's looking at, because everybody, where are the eyes going? Where are his eyes going? His eyes are going here, but he can't see anything there. It's a mist. It's a sublime background. And note that he is at the pinnacle of a long climb. He's at the top of human cultivation, and he's looking out, and he sees himself much like the Palace of Versailles, created for the Sun King Louis XIV. He is supposed to be looking into infinity. And what we see doesn't matter so much as what we feel. What does he feel? After climbing to such a height, he feels probably giddy and probably senses his fragility. Like if a big gust of wind comes up there and he's at the top, he get blown off and die. That portrait, though, reflects the shift from sight, which is a very neoclassical thing, to feeling, which is a very romantic thing. From what we can regulate and order and see in nature to what we can feel within us. It's a shift to psychology. To his feelings is the central focus of the painting. Now, how will you see this go on from here? Well, you'll see it in Impressionism, which also reflects not the landscape per se, but rather the feelings in relation to the landscape. You express that through, the cloudy portrait. I don't need to give you Impressionist paintings. Monet and company, they're very popular. It's giving a felt portrait, as it were. So this begins interestingly, in the discussion of the 18th century, when talking about language. Romantic poetics begins mid-18th century. I'm going to list a few writers that you will presumably not have read, I'm presuming. So I'll just say a little bit about them. One is the Abbé de Condillac, 1715 to 1780 are his dates, and it is the essay on the origin of human knowledge. I'll just put essay. And it's Condillac. I'm not going to spend any time on him, though. His essay is I think it's 1848. Why'd I even bother? Let me just remove him. Because it's not the human knowledge so much that is important, although it's connected, as the origin of human language. Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And this will be in, I'm translating origin of the inequality among, so discourse on the origin of inequality among human beings. And it's rooted in another work that he writes, which is an essay on the origin of languages sometime. And I don't even have an exact date for this. 40s, 50s, somewhere in there. Essay on the origin of language. If we're looking at things from a classical point of view, language is a feature of human nature. We have it. Where does it originate? It's not clear. There's also no thesis given for where language originates. There's a myth given about it, perhaps, but there's no thesis as such. In the scriptural account, it comes in Genesis. We're created in the image and likeness of God. God speaks everything into being. We bear his image. He speaks to human beings and he commands them. And they are understood to be able to respond to him, and they do respond to him because Adam himself then speaks in Genesis 2. When he names Eve, calls her Eve, the mother of all living. That's his first speech. But that capacity for speech then is part of the Imago Dei in the Christian or in the biblical understanding. Essay on the origin of language, however, presents things rather differently. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this. And Rousseau, in this essay, makes a very important theoretical distinction between gestures and words. Words are not said as in the second discourse on the inequality of human beings, to replace gestures by or signs by a single inexplicable process, but they differ from them in source and in kind. And language really begins in what we will call not in words, but rather in grunts and cries. This originates in Rousseau. So the first language, he says, the very first language was not articulate sound, rational. It was noises like animals make, vivid grunts and cries, which people would have used to explain or to relate to the world around them. And so the old grunts and cries. As the origin of language. And these grunts and cries expressed our feelings about the world. And the feelings could be conveyed in the same way that animals will make noises to one another. Yes, they designate something, but it designates their felt response to the world around them. That's the origin of language for Rousseau. Now, the reason I say that is because this is an anti-rational account of human language. In accordance with this view, the rational aspect of language comes later. It evolves from it. This is in strong emotions. Strong and powerful emotions are the source of human language. But there's also something that is concurrent with this in Rousseau's view, and that is that human nature itself, which I said was this ghost in a machine, our essential human nature is connected to our feelings then, or almost identical with our feelings. Our feelings are ourselves. I think that's implicit in the view. And over the course of time, so language originally is poetic, not scientific, according to Rousseau. It expresses who we are. And so the earliest forms of language are poetry, not prose. It's in song and in chants, and rather than in observations about the world around us, trying to convey information and so forth. The information being conveyed is our feeling in response to it. So the first writing is poetry, says Rousseau. And it is, it's passionate in nature. And ancient societies will create whole religions out of this. So they will divinize things like love. And they will divinize all of their strong feelings in the forms of the gods and so forth. So Mars, war, and so forth. These feelings become divinized and become part of early religion. Over the course of time, the refinement of poetry and music leads to the separation of music and poetry, and further, the development of writing, in which things become more and more distant from our original feelings. So the best poetry ever written was not written. It's oral in its account. So the best and most fundamental form of language close to human nature is speech, not writing. All of these things follow from the view. And the reason why people compose poetry is to delight. It expresses their feelings, expresses something deeply rooted in themselves. It expresses the thing that they felt to be divine in themselves. And so what would the human being that worked like this look like? Well, he would be the caveman. He would be the noble savage that Rousseau talks about. wherein lies his nobility? Not in his accordance with the natural law, but in accordance with he lived in nature as a creature of nature, as a being of nature, his felt connection to the world around him, the land around him, the sky, the water, the animal that he killed. That is what made him a noble savage. Now this becomes, again, this mythology of human nature arises in the 18th century. And I do want to call it a mythology of human nature. It's created by the poets of the 18th century, or if they're romantics, and the romantics themselves. They create a mythology of human nature. In accordance with that mythology, there are different ages. Best exponent in the English language is Peacock for Ages of Poetry. Rather than read it, let's just look at the summary of it. That's not a good summary. That was a bad idea. I won't use Wikipedia. That's a mistake. It's always a mistake. Should have looked at it before. But basically, he posits that in the beginning, there's the poetic age, which gives way to the religious age, which gives way to the philosophical age, which finally gives way to the scientific age in which we find ourselves. But at each stage of development, there is a greater and greater alienation of man from himself. So we're moving away from the way we ought to be by nature to the way we are now in our current day culture. And it's a degradation, it's an alienation, it's a loss of humanity that comes with this. These are strong notes in the Romantic period. Wordsworth talks about them all the time. And I will talk about them when we look at Wordsworth in a couple of classes. And in that account, we'll have the foundations of the so-called human sciences, because the human sciences which arise in the 19th century give at various times, but they begin with anthropology, which is the study of man by man from a scientific point of view. Right? That's what anthropology is. Which, just like psychology last time, I said the discipline of psychology begs the question of what we mean by the psyche. The question of anthropology begs the question of, well, what do we mean by man? If we're going to give this long history and the study of human nature from a scientific perspective, what is this thing that we call the anthropos? And if you say it's obvious, first of all, it's not. And the proof of that will be the different definitions I can present to you. So it's not obvious. And secondly, I think it's caught in an insuperable dilemma, which is it's trying to describe man objectively, even though we are man. How can you objectively define yourself when you're the subject of the experiment and the object? Is it possible to define yourself in a scientific, objective, detached fashion when you're included in the experiment, the study of man? You yourself are that. Is that not a problem? Like in the scientific method, are you not supposed to remove all bias from the experiment? How can the experiment be valid if the study of man includes what you are? And second problem, how can you know who you are if you didn't make yourself? How is it possible? It's not like you're a machine that you created. You are a being that came into being, and now you find yourself in that situation, but you can't know everything about yourself. It raises the anthropological question. And the study of anthropology just skips over that fact and proposes, on the basis of the Cartesian cogito, by the way, and on the basis of Rousseau's sense of human nature being connected to our feelings, to give a long history of human nature as it develops over the course of time without ever answering the question, what is a man? And the first person to write that question, as far as I know, is our man Augustine in his Confessions. Very, somewhere, book chapter 3, chapter 4, somewhere along there. Puts it in this way. Says, not with a question mark. Says that he is a question. He's a question to himself. He's a riddle. I'm a question to myself. How can I know who I am? You made me. You tell me. In other words, revelation is necessary to know who we are as human beings. It's necessary. We can't simply assume it. It has to be taken as a matter of credo. Has to be. And we can be pagans, like the ancients, and say that it came from some mythological account. That's the credo. They believe on the basis of this account. And then they just move on from it. In the Christian understanding, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And further, God himself takes on human flesh and becomes as us. He is the image of God. We are in the image of God. He is the image of the invisible God. But Jesus, in Colossians 1:15, is he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, talking about Christ. By him were all things created in heaven and earth and so forth. So he is, Christ is that. But we are made in the image of God, who is the image of God. So it's an image of an image. It's consequential stuff, and all of it bears on our notion of human nature, which from the vantage point of us is just a question. We're a riddle to ourselves. And we can't be anything but a riddle, because again, we have this scientific problem of objectivity. No, is that not obvious? You can't study something objectively if you are biased in your look at the thing. And of course you're biased, because your whole nature is involved in the question. What is the consequence of this for the Romantics that I have not yet addressed? They posit that human nature is good. It's good. So then how do they give an account for what they can clearly see that the world is not good? Where does evil come from then, if it's not from human nature? And human nature is identified with our feelings. Where does it come from? And the answer is, it comes from culture. It comes from society. It comes from reasoning. That's where evil originates. But that it's secondary to who we are. Who we really are is fundamentally good. And our feelings are fundamentally good. The origin of all goodness resides in our feelings. So we want to recover our true identity. We look to our feelings. Well, that grounds the whole discipline of psychology. Just like anthropology is based on this projected sense of self into the past that becomes more and more rational over the course of time and depicts the fall of humanity over the development of humanity, which will give rise to the talk I'm about to give on climate change and the environment. Like, what's going on there? Why do people hold to it so strongly as a matter of religious conviction and fervor, not just a scientific theory? But yes, sorry.
Augustine's saying he's a riddle to himself.
Mm-hmm.
C.S. Lewis says that the best way we can learn about human nature is actually to look at ourselves, because since we're human beings, we also know the most about us. So how would you reconcile that? Are they talking about the same thing? I think he talks about that in
Mere Christianity. Mm-hmm.
Or are they talking about two different things?
They're talking about two different things. If you want to recover human nature, so all knowledge is based on the knowledge of God and of man. I think Calvin begins his institutes with this, that our knowledge is comprised of the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man, but it's in that order. You don't, Lewis is wrong if he's contradicting Augustine on this. You can't know who you are. It's a methodological problem.
I think it might have been in relation, I don't quite remember, it might have been in relation to knowing about morality.
Yep, probably. Yep. Just like he does at the beginning, like the very first not chapter, but section of the chapter on is talking about our perception of fairness on the playground. He said, we're aware of injustice at a very young age. We don't need to be taught what injustice is. We immediately know it. When somebody does something and somebody says, that's not fair, they're not informing them of something they don't know about. They are telling them, you know that what you just did is wrong. I know it and you know it. It's clear to us. We both know that that's not fair, and yet you did it. Right? Well, how do we know that? And so then he's trying to show the moral nature of humanity. We don't even need to argue for it, or we shouldn't. Although when he asserts that, he's pushing against the whole Enlightenment and its tendency to say that our moral nature is actually a matter of feeling only. It's not really morality, it's feelings. But that would let's not go down that path. I think he's trying to make a different point. He's trying to connect his audience to thinking about these things and applying it to themselves. He's not making an anthropological statement per se, whereas Augustine is, or it's the basis for an anthropological statement. And his answer to the question of himself, he says, well, I don't know, Lord, you know, you made me. So it has to be revealed to him that. Colossians 3. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that, okay, no, I'll start with 3, verse 1. Forget it. If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. Martin Luther's favorite verse, by the way. Colossians 3, verse 3. We have no access to our life outside of Christ. We know who we are in relation to him. We're not our own. Remember I talked about that as first few verses of the Heidelberg Catechism, the first question, in fact. My life is hidden with Christ in God. I have no access to that self other than in relation to him, and I can speculate till the cows can come home. I can explore my feelings, and they will betray me, because there's an endless contradiction that I am to myself as well, which Paul also talks about in Romans 7. He wants to do something good, but he does evil. He's a question to himself. Every time I want to do this, I do that. And this is Paul, the man who knows Christ and has been saved by Christ, and yet he keeps on sinning. How is that even possible then? I want to do good. The good I want to do, I don't do. The good I don't do is also of negligence on my part. Who's going to save me from this? Well, thank the Lord that he has saved me from this predicament. I have no certainty outside of Christ. He's the foundation of all things. So, and that's the Christian answer. I know who I am because I know who he is. It's the rock on which not just the church is built, but human nature is built on that rock, and human personhood arises from that. Back to Rousseau. Rousseau most certainly gives rise to this idea that the first language is of natural cries and gestures, for which articulate sounds and instituted signs were eventually substituted. So when Augustine writes that when we read scripture, we see signs that point to things, Rousseau's theory of language precedes that. And so then you have to posit a long period of time from Adam to the account written in scripture. You have to have an old earth. You have to have a original human nature, which is probably not particularly rational in something, or pre-hominids that preceded Adam. And then you come up with the natural problem that arises out of that, which is that even if there were these pre-hominids, did they not die before Adam and Eve came along? In which case death is in the world before Adam and Eve. But it says in scripture that death is a consequence of human sins. So you got insuperable problems there. And all I will say is that this is a very complicated issue, but what is clear, at least from the vantage point of scripture, is that Adam was the first man. And he was a rational being who used language. He identified Eve in, I believe, Genesis 2:15, calls her Eve, mother of all living. Might be, I'm not sure if it's 15 or not. And that sense is conveyed in Luke 3 in the account of Jesus' origins, going back to the first man, namely Adam. So there's no pre-hominid. Why do we feel the necessity for a pre-hominid human race? Because of this. First person spoke in grunts and cries. A pre-rational being. Well, how long would it be between the pre-rational being and the rational being? It would have to be a very long time. How do we know that? Because we've seen no development in our time on this front. Zero. There's no sign of human development. So it has to be a very long time. So there are grunts and cries, and poetry is closer to gesture in the origin of language because it combines rather than decomposes many simultaneous eyes. So it's an animalistic view of human nature, which is still presented in the academy, by the way. People think that, what is it, what is it called now? Oh, I'm not going to come up with the chimp language, which is supposedly similar to human language, is the origin of human languages. So this is our relative, the chimp. He has something closer to human language there. And the bonobo human, there it is, not bobo. That's even funnier. But bonobo human. There you go. Bonobos have a form of communication similar to human language because they both combine individual calls into more complex phrases with meanings beyond the sum of their parts. So we can find this in these guys. Ooh, ooh. There you go. That's us. Grunts, cries. That's us. So the effect of this is to include within human nature the whole of the animal species. So it will lead to something that we're going to call as post-humanism, because humanism then is a category which is being imposed as a rational projection on human nature, which we're excluding the rest of the animal world from, but we're doing so out of prejudice for our own species. It's speciesism in literary theory, right? We're privileging the human over the Anthropocene. I'm not getting into that, but I'll do that next semester. In post-humanistic language, they're going to talk about the Anthropocene. You can look this up afterwards. I'm not going to digress from my digressions right now. But they will posit this as a way of reconciling ourselves to the earth and the rest of life. But this idea that poetry begins in feelings, in grunts and cries that are fundamentally precognitive, almost. gets picked up in Rousseau and also in another. So Rousseau is one, and the other is a German writer, very influential on the German Romantics, by the name of Herder, who again writes on the origin of language and again posits it in fundamental feelings. Now, when we come to the fundamental feelings, we're going to spend a great deal of time on this in the next 2 lectures. We're going to look at the sublime and the beautiful as these particular types of feelings that are articulated. This is the most divine of all the feelings that is felt, the sublime. What characterizes the sublime? Lack of definition, transcendence, suggestions of infinity, suggestions of, on our feelings part, our powerlessness, our sense of awe in the face of grandeur. These are sublime feelings. These are the ones that are best expressed in ancient epic poetry. It's so much of a rage in the 18th century that there is a Celtic bard by the name of Ossian. You can write them down. You can look them up if you have any interest in this. James Macpherson, who's a Scottish anthropologist, discovers a bunch of oral poetry written by a Celtic bard by the name of Ossian. He publishes them, he hears them, he learns the Celtic languages, he writes them down and distributes them, and all over Europe, people are wild about Ossian, the Celtic bard Ossian, who they say writes the most sublime poetry, and they call it sublime. It's always sublime. Celtic bard who wrote in, he didn't write at all. It's been preserved in Celtic speech, and Macpherson writes them down for us. And everyone agrees, from Goethe onwards, all the intellects of Europe talk about the wonder of Ossian. There's a few doubters, like Samuel Johnson. But by and large, he is praised for his sublimity, until it turns out that Macpherson is a total fraud. He made it all up and became wildly popular for writing the oral poetry of the Celtic bard Ossian. So you would say, okay, a couple of things. So Macpherson is a very clever shyster. Okay, fine. But why did the poets and intellects of the 18th century so love Ossian's poetry? And if they loved him while he was a fraud, was he still not a great poet when they discovered he was a fraud? What's the difference? You see the issue. If Goethe is praising Ossian for being a great poet, and then we find it's not Ossian who wrote it, but Macpherson, why don't we just conclude, well, it's not Ossian, Macpherson's the great poet? Why do they drop the idea that it's great poetry? Suddenly, what made it bad poetry? A serious question. What made it bad poetry suddenly?
It wasn't following from the tradition of the epic poets, like Ossian, the character, being like a bard character, speaking.
Of course, he's a bard as well, yes. But more than that, yes?
There's that element we talked about the character of the author themselves blending. So there would be some.
It's not an expression of Ossian's being anymore. It's of Macpherson's being. And Macpherson is a contemporary, civilized, educated Scottish individual who is virtue signaling about the past. But it's just that. It's made up. It's not, he's writing for his audience. His audience loves it, but they can't distinguish Macpherson from Ossian, because there's no way of distinguishing Macpherson from Ossian. So either the poetry is good or the poetry is not good. If the poetry is good, it remains good even though Macpherson wrote it, unless the point of the poetry was never the language, but rather the feeling behind the poet. And that has been fraudulently represented by Macpherson as Ossian's work. So that becomes the point of Romantic Poetics. It's not about the writing, it's about the feeling represented by the writing. All true poetry, then, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, as Wordsworth defines it. And we're coming to Wordsworth in a couple classes. In Preface to Lyrical Ballads, he will say that all, did I say all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Poetry equals feeling, not writing. It's the feeling that's the poetry. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from Rousseau. The origins of languages are poetic, and they are articulations of inarticulate feelings. They're grunts and cries. Our nature is most strongly connected with our feelings. How do we know that? Well, babies have feelings, but they don't have words. So the baby becomes a sort of like a potted anthropology there of human nature taken, projected back historically. Babies aren't born speaking. It's a whole mythology. And we'll find that it's expressed in paintings like this. I gave you the Las Meninas perspective, but the centrality of human nature in the perspective. Human nature now is in the background. Actually, it's in the foreground looking into the background, but the real foreground is the background, and the background is pulled into the foreground, and the guy who's in the foreground is actually looking into that. So our look at human nature is now not looking at an objective thing, it's looking at ourselves. We're always looking at ourselves. We're always self-regarding. As I put it, we are self-interpreting orphans. Let's just put it that way. And the orphans who are in the position of heroism, to resolve and to fulfill their heroic task, what do they have to do to figure out what to do? They have to look into their feelings. Nobody can tell them what to do. Just think of Dumbledore and Harry Potter. Go to the wise old Dumbledore, what should I do? I don't know, Harry. You know. There's something in you. Same thing for all the Marvel superheroes. You could look, there's something there in you that you need to figure it out. And if you don't do it, nobody will. Even Tolkien, as much as I esteem him, puts Frodo in that position. He's not an orphan, but he's close to it. Right? He's going into a dark place, and if you don't find a way, no one will. I love Tolkien, but he's really putting him into that position of, it's just a cultural mold that we're just thrust into, that we're the solution to every problem, or some representative of us. And we might be that representative, because that person is literally anybody. It can be you and me. And so there's a restless drive to assert ourselves and the importance of our feelings amongst ourselves. I want my feelings to be heard. And if I don't, my very humanity is at stake. If I don't do it, somebody else will. As Blake says, he has to create or be enslaved in another man's vision. He has to be original. Otherwise, he doesn't even exist. So there's the shift. It's a huge shift. It's an anthropological shift. It's a worldview shift. It changes the whole of Western culture. It originates not in the machine age of the 19th century. It originates in the Enlightenment era with the speculation that human language originates from the cogito through language, which is an expression of feeling. I won't give you any more on this. I can say a lot more, but manageable chunks. Any questions or reflections? Yes.
Just once again, I know you've been doing
it. It doesn't matter, please. No.
You could connect the dots for me between Descartes and Rousseau.
Well, Descartes precedes Rousseau, of course.
Yeah.
You know, Descartes writing 1640s. Rousseau about 100 years later. If you look at philosophical discussions of modernity, they will put Descartes first, and they'll be happy to throw Rousseau under the rationalist tradition, although he's not rationalist in some ways, but he still fits in. Think, well, how is Rousseau a rationalist when he actually sees reason as a form of oppression and civilization as a form of oppression, and what it oppresses is what is most essential about him, and what is most essential about him are his feelings, and society oppresses him. It doesn't understand him. It doesn't understand who he really is and his nature. In fact, society seems to be constructed to be so alienating that it oppresses humanity. There's the cri de coeur, that, you know, I'm oppressed by the world around me. Nobody understands me, whatever. By the way, this is just an aside, but Rousseau had 5 children and he put them all in orphanages. There's a terrible sidebar, but if you look at the intellectuals that are most influential in the Western tradition post-Enlightenment, you will find a common ground of fatherlessness. It's not only that the image and the ideal of the orphan is there, they themselves were abandoned by their fathers. Faith of the Fatherless. The Psychology of Atheism. Interesting book, written 12 years ago. Sees a strong pattern of atheism that comes from having no father. And not only is it then changing the whole worldview of the people therein concerned, it gets projected as heroic, what they're doing, because they didn't have one. They see their own life. They're battling against a very difficult world. So I have great sympathy on that front. However, these are not people to be trusted and followed as the template for the rest of us. Did I explain it? Ask again if I didn't. Connection between this and Rousseau was the question, right? So if the res cogitans is the thinking reality, the thinking thing. A res is a thing or a reality. The problem is connecting that thinking thing, which is immaterial, to everything outside it. How does it connect? How do we connect that to everything outside of us? And the answer that Rousseau provides is through feelings. That res, now for Descartes and the rationalist tradition, it's through thinking as in reasoning. But there's no reason why that res could and the way of connecting to the world outside of it should be through reasoning. The only reason that Descartes concludes that is because he comes from the Western tradition. And in the Western tradition, from Boethius onwards, what is a person? And the answer is an individual substance of a rational nature. Rational nature. Well, that went off. That's Boethius. That's what a person is, an individual substance of a rational nature. Descartes follows in that tradition as far as he connects reason as central to our nature. Yes, he does. But what is his view of human nature? Is it personal? No, it's depersonalized. He can't connect his mind to his body. And yet a person is somebody who has a body in Christian anthropology. There's no such thing as a non-carnate person, except in God. But then Jesus takes on human flesh. He literally is incarnate in the flesh, born of the Virgin Mary, crucified, and rises on the third day, ascends bodily to the right hand of the Father on high. But the bodily nature of Jesus shows us that bodies are part of human nature, that it's not his mind that rises. It's not the consciousness of the disciples in which Jesus lives. Jesus lives in the person of his Son, and we share his humanity. So God's nature as person can be, doesn't need to be incarnated, but human nature does. And Jesus took on that human flesh. Because, right, the Trinity is spiritual personhood. Before Jesus is incarnated, he is three persons in his nature. But then he takes on human flesh, and so to be a human is to have that. But in Descartes' rendition of it, human nature no longer has a body or personhood, and it has then the mind-body problem, the idea of a ghost in the machine. So how does the ghost work? He works either through reasoning or through feeling. Those are the two answers to the problem that Descartes creates by his method of doubt. Those are the two answers, and both answers are wrong or inadequate. But in their exclusive articulation, they're just flat wrong. And both of them has a problem with reconnecting ourselves to our bodies. And so as a consequence, we do terrible things to human bodies, which we talked about Frankenstein at the outset. That's a scientific portrait of the problem of human nature, bequeathed by an Enlightenment view of the body. And it's a problem that doesn't go away. I traced it through Lewis's science fiction. I traced it in The Lord of the Rings as well. If you were in that class, I talked about exactly that human nature is what's at stake. I'm writing a book on that right as we speak. So it's not just about Lewis and Tolkien. It is about a larger problem, and I think they're responding to the larger problem. And they do it as Christian humanists. Both of them are Christian humanists. This is a sort of a humanism. It's not a very good one. It is a sort of humanism. But you could argue that even the race is, and if you come on the side of feeling as opposed to reason, then you're going to say that animals also ought to be included. And then we're getting into post-humanism. Because we, unlike all the other animals, do terrible things. Animals do what animals do. They don't transcend their species. They don't massacre one another. They're not guilty of sin. They don't commit crimes. But human beings do. So if feeling is the source of human nature, then we push towards post-humanism. And the idea that our carbon footprints need to be reduced so that we can save the planet from us, not our actions, but just from us existing. So it's a nihilism and annihilationism in the dark green ideology of the day. Help? Does that answer the question? Okay. The more clear, the more crazy it sounds, but it is crazy. I think it's crazy. What happens if you don't know God, and what happens if you don't know who you are? Not good things. Okay, I'll finish for today then.